So in a way, they've actually become the centers of excellence and sort of the experts in terms of doing this model. Anybody have any questions about infrastructure? It's for the most part pretty straightforward. I know there's a comment, there are some communities that have particular needs. So for instance, the aerospace industry and some of the automotive industries have regulations that mandate that they keep much more rigorous, so not just IP like we've been talking about here, but much more rigorous maturity and sort of robustness metrics on software over the long term. So their needs are sort of a subclass of what the rest of the community needs and the rest of the industry needs. So, okay, so we covered infrastructure.
Well, basically, and I think the last one we really had kind of touched on is owner and community, and I think fundamentally, where I see this as probably the most common example of this is where a kind of a commercial company may see an opportunity, they may sponsor an open source code, an open source project, and then in order for the community, for number one, to kind of get it out of the company for their own reasons, but also to foster some confidence that this isn't kind of a puppet controlled by the company, that it actually goes to, whether it's foundation or under a sponsorship of another organization, just to kind of go forward. But there's also really the evolution. There's also, these projects don't prove to be interesting unless there are, communities of both users and contributors. So you really have to keep fostering, and I think part of the evolution of projects is as they kind of transform based on the needs of their users and their communities. It's just having those communications, and as the personalities change, as people turn over, but and some of these projects just have a certain life, right? They come to a certain point where I think there was a security project recently that they just shut down, and there was all this speculation about it and they just got tired of working on it. They didn't want to do it anymore. So I mean, that's the other thing is these projects have kind of evolve and have a natural lifespan. I think we're at pretty much the end of our time, but Q&A.
Sure. Kind of interesting, a number of years ago we had a meeting with the Ontario government, and my associate and I founded the Linux Professional Institute, which has become the world's largest Linux certification. And it's kind of interesting because we were at there was an interest on moving away from Microsoft to an Apache open office platform, but the bureaucrats said, hell will freeze over before we adopt an open source platform. It's kind of interesting because just about 2 weeks ago in the Brazil NetMundial sessions, the president of IEEE said that they have a commitment to open source, and there was a long discussion of open hardware, which is really amazing because I've been working with ISOC and IEEE on these issues of open hardware and open source. In fact, Alfredo and I wrote a paper for the Open Source Review, right? It's called TIM in Ottawa, and on open hardware licensing, particularly on the WeCare solar system. So be happy to share that paper with everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, I find it, I find the state government use of open source is, for my amusement, I engage periodically with my contacts in the federal government, and they kind of end up something like this. I talk to the lawyers, and they say, we're monitoring it, but we really don't think much is happening, and we'll get around to doing it. And then I talk to the people on the technical side, and they're saying, we're doing all kinds of funky things, but we don't really feel that the lawyers or the things in place. But I think they're great. There's also some great initiatives. I know at one point they were looking at deploying Open Office through the Canadian Electoral Branch, and I saw a demo on that. So there were some really, I think, they're fascinating opportunities. But I see the public sector is a natural place to adopt open source, especially to foster the collaboration around between. So, Alfredo?
Yeah, it's a question about open source hardware and the humanitarian projects. If I understood the presentation and the discussions we had leading to the presentation today, do I understand correctly that if I contrast the type of development at CERN, which was clean room, native development that was shared through a license to the world, versus what we have seen for some of the hardware development at IEEE, where it's a lot of people doing some work and then collaborating and taking off some of the shelf components and combining them into a messy development that where, you know, the ownership of the different pieces is not well defined from the beginning, and trying to define the parts that have been contributed under an open source license. So, you know, you have the clean room, well-defined process, and the messy process that just happened because of how the community evolved and the interest. So between the two of them, if I understood, you were saying that regardless of how you develop, if it's something you know, complex, there's already going to be a solution similar to that, and you need to protect for that. You know, if somebody has interest, you know, you'll have to be ready to challenge the ownership on that IP. So if I understand correctly, is that yes, you have to have a process based on principles and experience that have been shared here, but you cannot go away from having the means to protect the IP and a way to assert your claims on the intellectual property you are claiming for your projects. Is that correct? Would that be a correct assessment?
So I mean, there's fundamentally, I guess, two reasons you approach governance in the context you're discussing. One is to feel confident that you are actually getting the rights that you are supposed to get. So, you know, it can be kind of embarrassing. I mean, we didn't have a slide on the risk of open source compliance. And fundamentally, I think the real risk of open source non-compliance is embarrassment. Because I think shame is one of the greatest motivating kind of forces. So it'd be kind of embarrassing, you know, on some of these projects to find out that you didn't have the rights that, you know, it's kind of, the other side of it is, okay, well, do you want to actually enforce? You know, you're trying to enforce it against certain kind of commercial interests. But then, depending on where you are on the open source side, you're not really, you know, unless someone is going off and, you know, taking your project and claiming it's their project, for the most part, you really try to create the conditions under which all the different entities can play. So in which case, as long as everyone's playing by the rules that you've established around your project, they can pretty much do what they want to. So then enforcement becomes less of an issue.
So, related to Ray's kind of plan for CSI, when we're talking about humanitarian context, we're talking about potentially, in some cases, global distribution, perhaps global manufacturing. How well does this stuff travel? How well does the protection travel? How well do the spirit and the letter of the agreements travel? Particularly when some of these countries either do not have the same governance structure that we might be used to, and in some cases they don't care. There's certainly been accusations been made towards China about them violating patents, North American patents and so forth. So
yeah, and I think that there, you know, in terms of the, you know, I think like the fundamental model of ensuring that you have the rights necessary around your project, I think that actually travels well country to country in the sense of that part of it is pretty much kind of universal, and I think it's a base condition. In terms of, say, the enforceability of the rights, you know, that's going to depend fundamentally on what are the conditions, you know, in the country. And then, you know, on some of these things, you know, there's a broader discussion about the ability to kind of, you know, steer perhaps business one way, achieving certain objectives. You know, at the end of the day, the philosophy of open source, both, you know, I think hardware and software, is we're not distinguishing between players, fields of endeavor. This is just kind of, we're creating a level playing ground, and you can do what you want to do with it. That we're really leveling. And does that prevent the stronger players from having an advantage in a level field? No. But it also means there are players that would never, ever otherwise be on the field are now there. So, and you've actually, in some senses, if you create the project appropriately, the commercial interests are a bit disadvantaged because they can't use their size and their power to change the rules in their favor because they're already set.
I think the biggest risk for Sunblaze is not somebody coming up with a product that competes with them. In fact, I believe there already is one. And sorry, I don't want to speak for Ray, but if people are getting a benefit from it, great. The biggest risk is damage to the reputation of the project. If somebody creates a product that underperforms, has safety issues or quality issues, even though you didn't actually source it from an IEEE entity or your project may be damaged because people associate that with you. So, and that's, I know, a trickier.
Yeah, the reputational risk is a big one, and you know, we're having a kind of a chat on the way down. Okay, what's different between open source hardware and open source software? And I said, like, you know, software itself can't hurt me. It has to be running somewhere on some machine somewhere. But so the software, somebody has to take it. You know, on the other hand, hardware once it exists can do, you know, that Google card could take me over the cliff if it's not programmed well. Like it's, you know, it actually has real impact on the world. And the design, hardware design is the flip side of something real. So for hardware, product liability issues, it acts in the world in a different way than software. So I think whenever, you know, so the control around, you know, and that's where projects, a lot of projects, both on the hardware and on the software side, put a lot of value in trademarks. The use of the trademark is something that you can't use the brand unless you are compliant. You can at that point you could have all kinds of certification requirements as a condition of using the brand, and there could be a lot of control using your trademark as a way of kind of policing quality and those reputational concerns. But we're over and people are waiting to come into the room, correct? So thank you very much for your time.
Okay.